Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, August 24th, 2022. And on this episode, I'm going through the top 4 reasons or purposes that the founders gave us during the time of ratification for the Second Amendment. And no, this isn't going to be an episode about muskets or hunting. I'm going to get to all that in a moment. But first of all, a quick hello and a huge thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't thank you enough for spending some of your time with me. And while we allow people another minute or so to get notifications to join us on the live stream, I want to say hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Cheriton Farmer in Missouri, Brian in Georgia, Sharon Patriot from here in Southern California, Tyler B., good to see you, Clay Kent, Kirk Morrison near Camden, South Carolina, Emmett Matthews, Christine Meyer, Melissa, Brad in Palm Beach, William Andrew Perry, and everyone else. I appreciate you being here. There's Derek in Tennessee, and I know I skipped over a few, but I want to get right to this. I'm cutting the intro a little bit shorter than normal, and I should mention that if you want to follow along with the stuff that I'm mentioning, the articles, other episodes, and original source documents that I'm going to be citing in this episode, you have to follow us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. About 1 to 2 hours after each live stream is done, I publish a blog post for every single episode, now over 4 years of those. And there you're going to find all the different platforms we're on, a section for each episode with the show links for the references that I mentioned, so you can read and learn more in context on your own time, and even our membership program, where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. We make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Anyways, let's get right to it. And of course, we should start out with the text of the Second Amendment, right? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I'm going to leave the debates and discussions over commas and definitions of words like militia and infringed and things like that, and arms and bear, to other episodes, other people maybe. I think it's really essential to understand the purpose for this. Why did the founders actually want this included? Or why was this an important founding principle? And here from an article by Rob Nadelson, he says, history makes it clear that the Second Amendment is designed to serve 4 principal purposes. I think most people just think of one. Whatever is most important to them, they generally get one of these 4 right when they're in support, but they rarely get all 4. Maybe you'll see some people with a couple. But he says, let's start out with the first one. First, it guarantees the state's militia power of their own to balance the military power of the federal government. This is the first thing that Rob's mentioning. No one said specifically that this was the first, but this is the one that I've seen come up most often when I'm reading debates over ratification. The ability of states and militias to balance the military power of the federal government. There was great fear, of course, because of an occupying army, living under an empire that used the military power to enforce its unconstitutional acts. There was the massacre in Boston, of course. The founding generation was well aware of the dangers of standing armies. They hated and feared them. Here's, for example, the so-called father of the Constitution, James Madison, saying, as the greatest danger to liberty, not near the top, not close to the top, not once in a while, not here and there, not just over there with those guys. The greatest danger to liberty is from large standing armies. It is best to prevent them by an effectual provision for a good militia. This was a consistent, whether it was Federalists like Madison or Anti-Federalists, which I'll get to in a moment, they all recognized the dangers of standing armies. They lived it. They fought a long, bloody war to get away from an empire that used a standing army to enforce its will over the will of the people. And in general, we often heard them say, well, we know government will try to do this, so they won't have the reason to do it if all the people are armed. If we have a powerful militia, they won't have the excuse to thrust this upon us. Here, for example, is Federal Farmer. I know a lot of people think this was Richard Henry Lee. I can leave that discussion for elsewhere. I think it was most likely Federal Farmer was probably written by Melancton Smith up in New York, but we can talk about that another time. Here he is in Federal Farmer number 18. What's the date on this? I don't know off the top of my head. Usually I know these. January 25th, 1788, here even over at Teaching American History, which I will link to in the show notes. They've got Richard Henry Lee listed as the author. And here he writes, a militia, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves. Keep in mind, the notion of a militia was not something, because it was going to be used to counterbalance the federal military power, the military power of a standing army of the central government for good reason, because they didn't want that central government to be able to enforce stuff over the will of the people. A true militia is not something that's under the constant control of the federal government, because then that defeats its entire purpose. And that's why, over and over, we hear the founders tell us that the militia was the body of the people. Here, again, federal farmer. A militia, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves, and render regular troops, in a great measure, unnecessary. Unnecessary. Render the military power unnecessary. And here I did an episode on this just a couple of months ago that I think is one of the most important ones I've done in recent times. Second Amendment to prevent the greatest danger to liberty, citing James Madison, of course. The founding generation repeatedly warned us about the dangers, great dangers to liberty posed by large standing armies. The best way to guard against that danger, prevent the need for them. So that's the first purpose of the Second Amendment, to ensure that the body of the people are armed, so then there's less reason, less excuses made to have a large permanent standing army. Back to Rob, he says, second, it promotes the God-given right of personal self-defense, individual, natural right to self-defense. Here's James Wilson in his lectures on law. This is one of the leading advocates of the Constitution. In fact, his State House Yard speech of October 1787 was far more influential on ratification than the Federalist in various states. Of course, the Federalist was very influential in New York, but that's the audience that it was primarily written for. And here he is in his lectures on law. Wilson was one of the first justices of the Supreme Court, associate, nominated by George Washington. Here he says, the defense of one's self, again, self-defense, individual right of self-defense, again, a natural right as well. He said, without my commentary, let's let Wilson's words do the trick. The defense of one's self, justly called the primary law of nature, is not, nor can it be abrogated by any regulation of municipal law. Again, it's a natural individual right of self-defense for the individual. That's James Wilson. And here's St. George Tucker in his view of the Constitution of the United States, which Thomas Jefferson thought was probably the most important book on the Constitution at that time. It was really the first systematic detailed overview of the legal meaning of the Constitution in its original form. Here's St. George Tucker says, the right of self-defense, again, not self-defense in a collective way. Certainly you're talking about militia is to push back against the need for a standing army, but then there's also another purpose, individual self-defense. It's the first law of nature. That's St. George Tucker. And here's how Rob put it. In order to enable people to defend themselves, and this is an important point, the right to keep and bear arms has to include weapons sufficient for that purpose. Think about that. If people are limited to just muskets, right? They can't really defend themselves against criminals or, other people who have much more powerful weapons. He says, which weapons are sufficient for the purpose of self-defense will vary according to changes in technology and society. In other words, it just keeps expanding. So something that was needed for self-defense in 1790 or 1791, for example, you need something much more powerful these days. Of course, the gun grabbers want you to think that the second does not cover advances in technology, but this is absolutely absurd. Here's how Rob described it. The Second Amendment cannot be limited to muskets and flint rocks any more than the power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce can be limited to trade in sailing ships and horse-drawn wagons. And I think that's a really great way of putting it. There's a lot of analogies that come to mind now that I read this again. This is like a 10-year-old article based on a speech that he did in Colorado some years ago. And I hadn't read it for quite some time. And that really, there's so many different analogies because that's what they throw at us. Oh, this is just for muskets. That's all they knew about at the time. So does that mean the right to the free press only includes a printer? It certainly doesn't include anything else, right? He goes on, he says, the right to keep and bear arms must include the free use of modern technology appropriate for self-defense. I think that's pretty straightforward stuff. And of course, governments never like the idea of individuals being able to defend themselves, their homes, their family, their property, and of course, their state and their country from foreign and domestic tyrants, of course, right? They hate that stuff. Here's how James Madison put it. He said, government, this is in Federalist 46, governments are afraid to trust the people with arms. Madison knew why. Because the nature, the essence of government is power, as Madison put it some years later, and power in human hands is always liable to abuse. And the more that the people are armed, the less likely that they can actually abuse that power. Well, it still happens, certainly. Anyways, in addition to self-defense, this is number 3 now, the Second Amendment was adopted to enable citizens to defend against tyrants, foreign and domestic. And that's my number 3, is I want to talk about protection against foreign invasion. Of course, the founding generation talked about this all the time. It was considered the first line of defense, not, of course, effective to actually necessarily do the job on its own, but certainly the first line of defense. As at this point, Rob writes, it becomes helpful to turn to the Second Amendment's preamble. The Second Amendment seeks a well-regulated militia, and we have to understand what that means in 18th century language. In that context, they weren't saying well-controlled by the government, well-limited, not regulated the way they put today, because regulate in many ways today really actually means prohibit. When they say we're going to regulate this behavior, they mean ban. And that's not what the founding generation meant it to mean or understood it to mean. In 18th century language, Rob writes, a well-regulated militia meant a well-trained one. The militia that the Second Amendment says should be well-trained consists of all able-bodied men, or even as Federal Farmer put it, everyone, the people themselves. Not just men, not just women, not any age, no limitation according to the Federal Farmer. I got to jump back to where I was. Here's Patrick Henry. The militia, sir, is our ultimate safety. We can have no security without it. So if we're talking about all able-bodied men or all the people themselves, we can have no safety unless the people are part of the militia and therefore armed. Henry later on said, the great goal is that every man be armed. Not most, not some, but every single one. Here's George Mason. This is in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, I think June 4th. I ask, who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people, except a few public officers. Everyone, the whole people, not age 18 to 60 like Tench Coxe thought. Some people thought it was more limited. George Mason, just like Federal Farmer, thought it was absolutely everyone. And that's I tend to lean that direction. Maybe it's confirmation bias. Here's Tench Coxe's view. The powers of the sword are in the hands of the yeomanry of America from 16 to 60. The militia of these free commonwealths, entitled and accustomed to their arms, when compared with any possible army, must be tremendous and irresistible. Who are the militia, he wrote. Are they not ourselves? And Rob explains this. He said, so all men of military age, if you're talking about Tench Coxe's view, or George Mason, would be everyone, Federal Farmer, everyone, all men of military age should be well-trained, that's well-regulated, in weapons so that America survives as a free country. And we're so far from that, it's unbelievable. I am not well-trained. I would like to be. I suck at this. But I really, really need to keep learning and getting better. And Rob continues. He says, well, what weapons? We got to get back to that again. Is it muskets and flint rock? Absolutely not. Obviously, the muskets and single-shot rifles in use when the Second Amendment was adopted are no longer sufficient to do the job. Today, the Second Amendment protects a range of weapons appropriate for citizen militias resisting both foreign invaders and tyrannical politicians. And those of you who know, you know, an AR, the way that they allow an AR to be built legally today, they call that an assault weapon or a military weapon, but you're not going to really last in a conventional warfare more than a few minutes with a civilian version of an AR. Maybe what's the one? An M4A? I can't remember what the military version of this. So he's basically saying, like, in order to be able to serve this purpose, the people actually have to have the ability to have military-grade weapons. Military grade. And that's how Tench Cox put it. Tench Cox put it. Their swords and every other terrible implement of the soldier are the birthright of an American. Again, a natural right. It's your birthright. Just because you exist. It's not because you got a permission slip or you passed some class. As soon as you're born, this is your right, because it's your right and your duty to defend yourself, your home, your liberty, your state, your country from enemies, foreign and domestic. It's so important. And that brings me to the last one, which is defense against domestic tyrants. And I don't hear enough of this. And it's not always just about, and a lot of people, I think, just get this wrong. They think it's only about shooting them up. But it really is about, well, this will make sense, I think. Rob writes that the author of the first draft of the Second Amendment was James Madison. Madison's favorite book of political theory was Aristotle's Politics. Several times in that work, Aristotle makes the point that all citizens should have weapons. Why? Well, we'll get to that again in a moment. And that only those with weapons should be citizens. So Aristotle, which was the influence for James Madison, or one of the primary ones, is saying the only people who are really citizens are those who actually have weapons. Otherwise, he wrote, those that are disarmed are the slaves of those who are armed. And that's really what, when you talk about what government does, whether they're using gun control on people or on a state or on another country, for example. Gun control is about keeping certain people, certain organizations, certain groups, certain individuals in a state of submission to those who have the military force, and that's really essential. Here's from David Vanderkoy, which is an old law review article, Valparaiso University Law Review, The History of the Second Amendment. Again, I'm going to link to all this stuff over in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. He traced the right to keep and bear arms, individual natural right to keep and bear arms, back to Blackstone and English common law. This is an interesting part of this paper. He said Blackstone described the right to keep and bear arms as absolute or belonging to the individual, but ascribed both public and private purposes to the right. So the private purposes is just what we're talking about right here. The private purpose is defending yourself, your home, your family, your property. The public purpose is your duty to, well, help protect your neighbor, your community, your neighborhood, your state, your country from enemies, foreign and domestic again. Blackstone described this right as necessary to secure the actual enjoyment of other rights which would otherwise be in vain if protected only, and this is by, in his words, the dead letter of the laws, recognizing that words on paper don't cause government to stop doing anything to anyone. They may give them a line in the sand, they may give them some pause, but really at the end of the day, according to Blackstone, without the right to keep and bear arms, laws on paper are dead letter. It's such essential stuff. Here's Nadelson again. He said, this point was made another way by Jean-Louis Delhomme, a Swiss jurist who wrote a book on the English Constitution that we know Madison read, and that was a source for other American founders as well. And here he is talking about the need for an armed citizenry. He said, the power of the people is not when they strike, but when they keep in awe. It's when they can overthrow everything that they never need to move. This is a good offense is the best defense. That's that mentality. And that's what Madison was influenced by, recognizing that the more that the people had the ability to overthrow, the less likely it would ever happen. And there's a Latin phrase. I think it's ostendite bellum passern habet. I can't do Latin, so whoever out there knows. Look toward war, and you shall have peace. And so if the people are prepared to be in charge and exercise their ultimate sovereignty, the power of the sword and the purse, they're never going to have to deal with the problems of ignoring that. And that's how Rob describes it. The widespread ownership of firearms, therefore, helps to preserve freedom, usually without the need for armed violence. And that's the essential point there. And that's how Tench Coxe described it as well. Tench Coxe, I keep getting that wrong today. The unlimited power of the sword is not in the hands of either the federal or state governments, but in the hands of the people. The ultimate unlimited. Notice, no limits. No limits at all. No restrictions on their ability. Because if we're talking about sovereignty, in the American Revolution, we are told so often it's just about taxation without representation. That's the way the government schools want us to think about it. That it was just about, oh, we need more representatives so we can have them tax us. No, no, no. That was an example of how the British used unlimited power, how the British exercised sovereignty, final authority. John Hancock specifically described it that way. He's like, it's not about taxation without representation. This is an example, an offshoot of how they claim the power over us in all cases whatsoever. They're exercising sovereignty, final unlimited authority. And the American Revolution was really about a change in thought regarding sovereignty. That is, the people are above constitutions, constitutions are above governments, etc., etc. So the unlimited final sovereignty, final authority is with the people. And that's how Tench Coxe put it as well. And I think Roger Sherman summed it up best. Here he is in the House of Representatives. I think this was 1790. He said, "It is the privilege of every citizen and one of his most essential rights to bear arms and to resist every attack upon his liberty or property by whomsoever made." Well, I hope you guys found this interesting and educational. I think it's so important to get all of this information out there to as many people as possible, because even people who are really good on the right to keep and bear arms, they generally miss at least that first one. They rarely talk about how it's so essential for the people to have the military power, because the founding generation thought large standing armies were so dangerous. This was a defense against the need for having them. And nothing helps us get this kind of information out to more and more people every single day than the financial faith and support of our members. Please don't feel obligated to join us, but if you've got a couple of bucks of fiat that you can throw our way, we will use every penny of it to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty against the largest government in history. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I do have a couple of minutes and see if I can answer some questions or read some comments here. There's a lot of comments coming through. So either you guys thought I was absolutely stupid in this one, or it's a very interesting topic. Certainly, we are facing an increasing amount of attacks on our natural right of self-defense year in and year out, certainly from the federal government, also from state and local governments. It happens all the time at every level. There is no place that is technically truly free, because you're not free if you still first have to get a government permission slip. Here's Haji 1954. That's exactly what I was getting at here. Don't comply, nullify. We're not asking permission to be free, or at least we shouldn't be. And I know we tweeted this yesterday from my great friend Robert Scott Bell, who does a health freedom show 6 days a week. I think it's noon to 2 Pacific time, but he says, stop asking for permission where none is required. So if you have a natural right of self-defense, as soon as you ask permission to do that, you're not actually acting free. Samuel Adams is correct. It's scary. Nobody wants to be ruined for standing up to the corrupt institutions. Of course, we don't want it. Not everything is a hill to die on, and that's essential to understand. But the more that people start doing things like this, the more that people start learning how to exercise their rights without getting permission from government, whether the government wants them to or not, the more that we can expand on this. That's our motto, actually, here to do another promotion, on our annual membership cards. If you get 1 year, 5 year, or lifetime membership, we give out these fun 110%. They're actually pretty cool cards with a foil inlay of our actual colors and etc. But there's a Latin phrase, concordia res parve crescunt. It means small things grow great by concord. This was written by well, I mean, by probably a lot of people, but the one that we associated with is John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution in 1767, writing letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania against the hated Townshend Acts. He was recognizing that even at that time, the first step that should be taken is a non-binding resolution of opposition, because he didn't think they could do more, and he was also pretty conservative in how he approached things. Dickinson was always kind of a middle-of-the-road guy, even though he ended up fighting the British on the front lines. But he thought the first step was just to get the word out there. And small things grow great by concord. If you're speaking truth and you're doing the right thing, other people will join you. And then when you get more people to join you, then you expand it a little further and a little further and a little further. And the Patriots certainly took that approach. They went a little faster than Dickinson wanted 9 years later, but still 9 years later, that's when the war for independence, that secession war that happened, and that actually separated them, the 13 free and independent states, from the Empire of Britain. But small things grow great by concord. The penman of the Revolution was absolutely correct. So we don't want to stick our neck out there and die on every single hill, but we have to start thinking about strategies to move forward without getting permission from government. Bonehead, give me liberty or give me death. It's a great quote from Patrick Henry. Clay Kent corrected me. It's the M16. I thought maybe M4A was another one as well. Anyways, I will look a little further in the comments later on, leaving comments, especially in the archive, along with reviews on Apple Podcasts and any other podcast platform. That will tell the algorithms, especially these mainstream platforms, to show us to more people. So please do continue doing that. I also get a lot of ideas for future episodes when I get feedback, questions, comments. Someone calls me out for an error. Sometimes I got to come back and fix things, etc., etc. So continue doing that, smashing the like button, sharing, etc. Don't forget our membership program over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. Nothing more important than that. Otherwise, I don't know what's the point. I mean, unless you want to just hear me blab about this stuff. But I hope you learned something, and I will see you next time here on the path to liberty.